sound of the slap echoed through the drawing room at Windsor Castle like a gunshot, and for 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Queen Elizabeth's hand still raised, trembling in the air, her palm stinging from the impact, and Prince Philip's face turned sharply to the side, a red mark already blooming across his cheek, his eyes wide with shock that quickly transformed into something far more dangerous. It was November 92, the year the Queen would later call her annus horribilis, and what Philip had just said to her, the words that had finally shattered 45 years of carefully maintained composure, would create a wound in their marriage that would never fully heal, would shift the balance of power between them in ways neither could have predicted, and would remain a secret so carefully guarded that even their children would never know the full truth of what happened in that room. But what could possibly drive the most controlled woman in the world to violence against her own husband? What words could be so devastating, so unforgivable, so precisely calculated to destroy, that they would break through decades of training and restraint? The fire crackled in the hearth, but the room felt ice cold. Elizabeth's breathing came in short, sharp gasps, her chest heaving beneath her perfectly pressed suit, her face flushed with a rage so pure and complete that it felt almost like relief. Finally, after years of swallowing insults and enduring humiliations and maintaining perfect dignity, while her husband made her life incrementally more difficult, she had struck back. And Philip stood there, one hand slowly rising to touch his reddening cheek, his expression cycling through shock and disbelief and wounded pride, and something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if he'd finally succeeded in proving something he'd always suspected, that beneath the crown and the composure, his wife was just as capable of losing control as anyone else. How long had he been pushing her toward this moment? How many years of calculated provocations had led to this exact second when her hand finally moved faster than her training could stop it? The newspapers had been brutal that morning. Andrew and Sarah's separation, Anne's divorce, Charles and Diana's disintegrating marriage playing out in all books and leaked phone calls. Windsor Castle still smoldering from the fire that had consumed so many irreplaceable treasures just days earlier. The monarchy itself under attack from politicians, questioning whether the royal family should pay taxes, whether they provided any value to modern Britain, whether the whole institution was an expensive anachronism that the nation could no longer afford. Elizabeth had read every article, absorbed every criticism, carried the weight of it all with her usual stoic grace. And then Philip had walked into the room, looked at her sitting there surrounded by newspapers, documenting the collapse of everything she'd worked to preserve, and he'd said the thing, the one unforgivable thing, that had finally broken her. What could those words possibly have been? "You failed," he'd said. Not shouted, not screamed, just stated it calmly, matter-of-factly, with the casual cruelty of someone delivering a diagnosis. As a mother, as a queen, as a woman, you've failed at everything that actually matters, and now the whole world can see it. The words had hung in the air for maybe 2 seconds before her hand moved of its own accord, before conscious thought could intervene, before a lifetime of training in emotional suppression could activate. The slap had been instinctive, physical, a rejection so complete that words couldn't contain it. And now they stood in the aftermath, two people who'd spent 45 years building a marriage on mutual respect and separate spheres and careful avoidance of precisely this kind of confrontation. Had he meant it? Had he been trying to hurt her? Or had he simply been stating what he genuinely believed? And did the distinction even matter when the damage was already done? Philip's hand dropped from his cheek. His jaw clenched. "Well," he said, his voice tight and controlled, "at least now we know what it takes to get a genuine reaction from you. 45 years, and I finally found the limit." The bitterness in his tone was caustic, decades of resentment distilled into a single sentence. All those years of perfect composure, perfect duty, perfect performance. But call you a failure, point out the obvious truth that your children are disasters, and your family is falling apart, and suddenly you're human after all. He stepped closer, and Elizabeth instinctively stepped back, shocked by her own retreat. "Do you want to hit me again? Go ahead." Maybe that's what we should have been doing all along instead of this endless charade of polite distance. What marriage survives this kind of confrontation? What relationship can recover when one person explicitly names the other's deepest fears and failures, and the other responds with violence? Elizabeth's hand was still trembling. She looked at it as if it belonged to someone else, this hand that had signed thousands of documents and waved to millions of people and never, ever struck another human being in anger. "Get out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute authority. "Get out of this room right now, or I swear to God I will do something we'll both regret even more than this." Philip laughed, actually laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that made her flinch. "Regret? You don't do regret, darling. You do duty. You do protocol. You do whatever the role requires while actual human emotions get locked away where they can't interfere with the performance. That's what you've done our entire marriage with me, with the children, with everyone. And now look where it's gotten us." He gestured toward the newspapers scattered across her desk. "Your children are miserable. Your family is a laughingstock. The institution you've given everything to preserve is crumbling. And you're still here, still playing the role, still choosing duty over every single thing that actually makes life worth living." Was he right? Was this brutal assessment actually accurate? Or was it just the cruelest possible attack from someone who knew exactly where to strike? She should have maintained her composure. She should have responded with icy dignity, dismissed him with royal authority, reasserted control over the situation and herself. But something in her had fractured when her hand struck his face, some seal that had kept 5 years of suppressed frustration contained. "You think I chose this?" The words came out rough, loaded with an emotion she'd spent decades learning to hide. "You think I woke up one day and decided to sacrifice everything? My privacy, my freedom, my relationship with my children, my ability to just be a person instead of a symbol, because it sounded fun, because I enjoyed it." Her voice was rising despite her best efforts, volume escaping her control. "I was 20, 5 years old, Philip, 25. My father had just died, and they put a crown on my head that weighed 4 pounds and told me I had to carry it for the rest of my life without ever showing how much it hurt. Do you have any idea what that's like?" Did he? Could he? Or had his own resentments about playing second fiddle, about walking 3 steps behind, about surrendering his career and his name and his independence, made him incapable of seeing her suffering? Philip's expression shifted slightly, some of the anger giving way to something more complicated. "I know exactly what it's like," he said quietly. "I've been living it too, remember. I gave up everything, my naval career, my titles, my independence, my entire identity, to be your consort, to walk behind you, to be introduced as the Queen's husband instead of as myself, to watch you disappear into that role while our children were raised by nannies because you were too busy being Queen to be their mother. Don't talk to me about sacrifice. I've made them too." The parallel hung between them. Two people who'd both surrendered essential parts of themselves to the machinery of monarchy, but who'd processed that surrender so differently that it had driven them apart instead of bringing them together. "The difference is," Philip continued, "I'm willing to admit that maybe the sacrifice wasn't worth it, that maybe we should have chosen differently, that maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with a system that demands we give up being human in order to be royal." Could he be right about that? Could the entire structure they devoted their lives to maintaining be fundamentally flawed, built on a premise that inevitably destroyed the people who served it? "We don't have the luxury of choosing differently," Elizabeth said, but her voice lacked conviction. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, a reflexive defense of a position she'd held for so long she'd forgotten to question whether it was actually defensible. "The monarchy isn't about us, Philip. It's bigger than us. It's about continuity and tradition and giving the nation something stable to hold on to while everything else changes. That's what my father understood. That's what I've tried to teach our children, even if they haven't quite grasped it." Even as she spoke, she could hear how the argument sounded, prioritizing an institution over the people who comprised it, defending a system that had clearly failed to protect or nurture the individuals caught within it. Is it worth it, though? Philip's question was softer now, less attack and more genuine inquiry. Is preserving the monarchy worth the cost it's extracted from you? From me? From Charles and Anne and Andrew and Edward? From Diana, who's clearly coming apart at the seams because she can't handle the pressure? At what point does the institution matter less than the people it's consuming? The question was dangerous precisely because Elizabeth had been asking herself the same thing, privately, in the dark hours when she couldn't sleep and the weight of everything felt unbearable. When does duty become destruction? When does service become self-annihilation? She sank into the chair behind her desk, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline of the slap draining away and leaving only a bone, deep weariness. The red mark on Philip's cheek was already fading, but the damage done to their relationship felt permanent, irreversible. I don't know, she admitted, the words barely audible. I don't know if it's worth it anymore. I don't know if anything we've done has mattered. I don't know if our children would have been happier, healthier, better people if we'd prioritized them over duty. I don't know if you and I would have had a real marriage instead of this arrangement, if I'd been willing to put our relationship before the crown. I don't know any of it, Philip, and the truly terrifying thing is that it's too late to find out. The choices have been made, the children are grown, the damage is done, and we're just going to have to live with it for whatever time we have left. The confession felt like surrender, like admitting defeat after decades of maintaining that everything was fine, everything was necessary, everything was worth the cost. What do you do when you finally acknowledge that your life's work might have been a mistake? Philip moved to the window, looked out at the grounds of Windsor Castle, stretching into the distance. His shoulders were tight, his postures were rigid with tension. Charles called me last week, he said after a long silence. He was in tears, actual tears. Said he felt trapped, said his marriage was a nightmare, said he'd made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to fix it. Do you know what I told him? Elizabeth didn't answer, wasn't sure she wanted to know. I told him to do his duty, to honor his vows, to put the institution first. I gave him the same advice we've been giving ourselves for 45 years. And then I hung up the phone and I thought, what if I just ruined his life with that advice? What if duty isn't the answer? What if we've been wrong about everything? The pain in his voice was naked, unguarded in a way Philip rarely allowed himself to be. That's what you made me realize today, with your accusation. You're right that I've failed. But you failed too. We've both failed because we've been serving a system that doesn't actually care about us or our children or anything except its own continuation. And I don't know how to live with that knowledge. How do you continue when you lose faith in the thing you've sacrificed everything to serve? Elizabeth felt tears pressing at her eyes. Actual tears, something she hadn't allowed in public in decades. But this wasn't public. This was just her and Philip and the ruins of what they'd built together. The fire at Windsor, she said, shifting topics slightly but not really. When I stood there watching it burn, watching centuries of history go up in flames, do you know what I thought? Philip turned to look at her, his expression guarded. I thought, maybe it's a sign. Maybe it's time to let it all burn down. The whole thing. The monarchy, the institution, all of it. Maybe we should just walk away, abdicate, let Charles deal with it or not, and finally try to be actual people for whatever years we have left. The words felt treasonous even as she spoke them, a violation of every vow she'd made at her coronation. But then I thought about my father, about how he gave everything to this role and died far too young because of it, and I thought, I can't betray his sacrifice. I can't let it all have been for nothing. So I keep going, keep performing, keep pretending it all matters and means something, even when I'm not sure I believe it anymore. Was that courage or cowardice? Loyalty or stubbornness? Faith or just fear of admitting she'd wasted her life? Your father, Philip said carefully, loved you very much, but he also trapped you in this role. Not intentionally maybe, but the effect was the same. Your uncle's abdication meant your father got a crown he never wanted, and his early death meant you got that crown decades before you should have. None of it was your choice. None of it was what you would have picked if you'd been free to choose. So why are you still treating it like a sacred calling instead of what it actually is? An accident of birth and timing that you've made the best of. The question cut to the core of everything Elizabeth had built her identity around. Was she devoted to duty, or just unable to imagine any alternative? Had she chosen this life, or just accepted it because refusing felt impossible? I loved my father, she said quietly. But you're right. He trapped me. Just like we've trapped our children. Just like the system traps everyone who gets caught in it. And I've spent 5 years telling myself that the trap was actually a privilege, a responsibility, a sacred duty. But maybe it's just a trap. The admission felt like a small death, the dissolution of a narrative she'd clung to for most of her life. What happens when you stop believing your own story? Philip crossed the room, stopped a few feet from her chair. The red mark on his cheek was almost gone now, just a faint shadow. I shouldn't have said what I said, he offered, something that wasn't quite an apology, but was close. It was cruel. It was designed to hurt you. And I'm not entirely sure I even believe it. That you've failed, I mean. You've done an impossible job under impossible circumstances for 45 years. That's not failure. That's something else. Survival, maybe. Endurance. Elizabeth looked up at him, saw the man she'd married in 1947, young and confident and full of life, before the years of playing second fiddle had worn him down. I shouldn't have hit you, she said. In 45 years of marriage, I didn't know I was capable of that. Philip's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. I did. I've always known you had that kind of passion in you, buried under all the training and protocol. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. You were fierce underneath all the proper princess behavior. I just forgot, I suppose, over the years. Or maybe you did. Had she forgotten? Had she buried that fierce girl so deep that even she couldn't find her anymore? They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of 45 years of marriage sitting heavy between them. Not a bad marriage necessarily. They'd had genuine affection, real partnership, moments of actual connection among all the royal obligations and separate spheres. But had it been a good marriage? Had either of them actually been happy, or had they just been playing roles even with each other? What do we do now? Elizabeth asked, and the question encompassed everything. The immediate aftermath of this confrontation, the broader crisis engulfing their family, the fundamental questions about whether any of it mattered. Philip sighed. We do what we've always done, I suppose. We carry on. We maintain appearances. We support the children as best we can while they navigate their own disasters. We fulfill our duties and perform our roles, and pretend we have answers when we barely understand the questions anymore. What else is there? The resignation in his voice was heartbreaking, the sound of someone who'd stopped fighting a battle he knew he couldn't win. But maybe, he added, we try to be a bit more honest with each other. Maybe we stop pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. Maybe we acknowledge that we're both struggling, both questioning, both trying to figure out how to live with choices we can't unmake. Could they do that? Could 45 years of careful emotional distance be overcome? Or were they too set in their patterns to change? Elizabeth stood, moved to stand beside him at the window. Outside, tourists gathered at the castle gates, cameras ready, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. They had no idea what was happening inside these walls, no conception of the very human struggles being waged behind all the ceremony and tradition. I do love you, she said quietly. I know I'm not good at showing it. I know duty has always come first and that's hurt you. I know you've made enormous sacrifices and received very little acknowledgement for them. But I do love you, Philip. You're the only person who's been through all of this with me, who understands what it's like, who knows the cost. If I've failed at anything, it's at making sure you knew that love was real, not just another royal arrangement. Philip was quiet for a moment, then his hand found hers, squeezed gently. I know, he said. I've always known, even when I resented everything else. And I love you too. Even when I'm angry about the life we didn't get to live, because of the life we had to live instead. Their fingers intertwined, two people who'd weathered decades together, who'd sacrificed and struggled and survived. Even if survival wasn't quite the same as thriving, could love be enough when everything else was falling apart? The newspapers still sat on her desk, documenting the family's failures in black and white. The fire damage to Windsor still needed assessing and repairing. The children still needed guidance through their various crises. The institution still demanded service and sacrifice and perfect performance. Nothing about their confrontation had actually changed the fundamental realities they faced. But something had shifted anyway. Some honesty had been spoken. Some long suppressed emotions had finally been acknowledged. "We should probably talk to Charles," Elizabeth said. "Really talk to him, not just lecture him about duty. Help him figure out what he actually wants instead of just telling him what he should do." Philip nodded. "And Anne, and Andrew, and Edward. Maybe it's time to stop pretending we have all the answers and admit we're making this up as we go along, just like everyone else." The idea was almost revolutionary. Royals admitting uncertainty, acknowledging mistakes, being vulnerable and human, instead of perfectly controlled and distant. Would the institution survive that kind of honesty? Did it deserve to if it couldn't? They stood together at the window for several more minutes, watching the tourists and the guards and the ordinary flow of life around the castle. Eventually, Philip moved first, releasing her hand with a gentle squeeze. "I should go," he said. "Give us both some time to process this." "But Elizabeth," he paused, turned back to face her. "We're going to be okay. Not perfect, not fixed, not healed completely. But okay. We've survived worse than this." Had they, though? Or had they just been better at hiding the damage? Elizabeth nodded anyway, taking comfort in his certainty, even if she didn't entirely share it. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "you haven't failed. Not at everything. You've been an extraordinary queen. You've held this country together through incredible change. You've given everything you had to a role you never asked for. That's not failure, Elizabeth. That's heroism, even if it came at a cost neither of us anticipated." He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed quietly behind him. And Elizabeth stood alone in the drawing room, her palms still tingling from the slap, her heart still racing from the confrontation, her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. Had she failed? Had he? Had they both, or neither? Or was success even a meaningful concept when applied to lives constrained by duty and tradition and roles they'd inherited rather than chosen? She returned to her desk, looked at the newspapers documenting her annus horribilis, and felt something unexpected, a strange sense of relief. The slap had been wrong, the words exchanged had been painful, but there had been a brutal honesty to it all that felt almost cleansing. For one moment, she hadn't been the queen. She'd been Elizabeth, a woman pushed past her breaking point by someone who knew exactly which words would shatter her composure. Was that failure, or was it just being human? And why had she spent so many years trying to avoid being human, as if emotions were weaknesses instead of what made life worth living? She thought about her children, each struggling in their own way with the impossible demands of royal life. Charles trapped in a loveless marriage. Anne divorced and determined. Andrew increasingly scandal-prone. Edward uncertain of his place. What would happen if she actually admitted to them that she didn't have all the answers? That she was questioning everything just as they were? Would it help them, or would it just remove the last illusion of stability they had? The fire in the hearth was dying down, shadows lengthening across the room. Elizabeth felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with emotional depletion. She'd spent 45 years maintaining perfect control, and in the span of minutes she'd lost it completely. Struck her husband, raised her voice, admitted doubts she'd never articulated before. The carefully constructed facade had cracked, maybe irreparably. But sitting there in the growing darkness, she didn't feel the shame or regret she'd expected. Instead, she felt something almost like freedom. Freedom to acknowledge that she was struggling. Freedom to admit that duty didn't answer every question or solve every problem. Freedom to be uncertain and conflicted, and overwhelmed without pretending otherwise. Was this what other people felt all the time, this permission to be imperfect? And if so, How had they survived it? How did anyone navigate life without the rigid structure of protocol and role to provide certainty? She stood, moved to the mirror above the fireplace, studied her reflection. The Queen looked back at her, perfectly styled hair, elegant suit, composed expression that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. But Elizabeth looked deeper, searching for the woman underneath the crown and the title and the performance. Who was she really, when stripped of all the royal trappings? What did she want, beyond fulfilling her duty? What did she believe, independent of what she'd been taught to believe? The questions felt dangerous, the kind of inquiry she'd spent decades avoiding, because the answers might be too destabilizing. But after today's confrontation, after slapping her husband and confessing her doubts and acknowledging her failures, what was the point of maintaining the facade anymore? The cracks were showing. The pressure was building. Something had to give, and maybe that something was the pretense that she had everything under control, that she knew what she was doing, that the monarchy was stable and secure and worth all the sacrifices it demanded. Maybe honesty, however painful and destabilizing, was the only path forward. Or maybe that was just exhaustion talking, and tomorrow she'd wake up and resume the performance as if nothing had changed. Which outcome was more likely? Which did she actually want? Years later, neither Elizabeth nor Philip would ever speak of this day. The slap would remain a secret between them, never mentioned to their children or staff or the biographers who would eventually chronicle their lives. The words exchanged would be locked away with all the other private moments that royals kept carefully hidden from public view. To the world, their marriage would continue to appear stable, functional, a model of royal partnership, and in many ways, that appearance wouldn't be entirely false. They would continue to support each other, to present a united front, to work together in service of the institution. But something fundamental had shifted between them that November day in 1992. The perfect composure had been shattered. The unspoken resentments had been voiced. The doubts and fears and failures had been acknowledged. And while they would go on performing their roles with the same dedication they always had, they would both carry the knowledge that underneath the performance, they were just two people trying to survive an impossible situation, making it up as they went along, hoping the sacrifices they'd made actually meant something even when they weren't entirely sure they did. Was that failure? Or was it just the human condition, made more visible by the crown and the public scrutiny, but fundamentally no different from what everyone else experienced? The gap between who we're supposed to be and who we actually are, between the lives we live and the lives we might have chosen, between duty and desire, between what we give and what we get, between the stories we tell the world and the truths we carry in private. And if royalty couldn't bridge that gap any better than ordinary people could, what exactly was the point of royalty in the first place? These were the questions that would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her reign. Questions without good answers, questions that made everything more complicated instead of simpler. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the questions mattered more than the answers. Maybe uncertainty was more honest than false confidence. Maybe admitting you didn't know was braver than pretending you did. Or maybe that was just what you told yourself when you'd finally broken, when the weight became unbearable, when the only choice left was between honesty and complete disintegration. She would never know for certain. She would just keep going, keep performing, keep carrying the weight, because that's what queens did. But she would do it with slightly less certainty, slightly more compassion, and the haunting memory of Philip's reddening cheek and her own trembling hand, and the moment when everything she'd built came dangerously close to collapsing completely. And somehow, that would have to be enough.